transportation or how people moved themselves and goods. Late 1700s to 1801. By 1801, 2/3 of the people living in the United States lived within 50 miles of the tidewater or the Atlantic Ocean. There were only 4 roads that crossed the Appalachian Mountains that you see going through North South Carolina, Virginia, Maryland, Pennsylvania, and parts of New York. The best highway was actually between Boston, Massachusetts, and New York City, better known as Manhattan. Best highway because it took 3 days to go that 175 miles between Boston and New York, and that was by stagecoach. There were no stagecoaches south of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. So if there were no stagecoaches, I guess that meant if you didn't have enough money, you weren't going anywhere, unless you had a horse and a saddle. Here's an example of a horse-drawn carriage. Now this is something that a very well-to-do person would own. Most people didn't have the money to afford this. Yeah, farmers obviously had horses and mules, but they probably didn't have something as fancy as this carriage. This is something on the level of maybe something that George Washington would own. Now here's an example of a stagecoach. Now this is for public transportation. Yeah, you did have to get a ticket to be transported on this. And notice it's being pulled by a team of horses. And these horses would probably go for about 25 miles and then they'd stop. And at that stagecoach stop, they would probably get another team of horses that's already well rested. And then they would go on their way. This is an example of what a stagecoach stop would look like. It looks like it's got lots of rooms, so if people wanted to spend the night, they could do that. And there probably was some sort of eating establishment here as well. And it probably was a situation in which you wouldn't just order whatever food you wanted. You were getting the food that they made for the day. Now here's a map of all of the land that we got from Great Britain at the end of the Revolutionary War. Yeah, we won a lot of land, all the way to the Mississippi River, as you can see here. And this land is going to be organized into what we call the Northwest Territory. Yep, that's correct. Illinois, where we are, was considered the Northwest. Well, why was it Northwest? It was north of the Ohio River, and it's west of the Appalachian Mountains. So there was a law that was passed that stated there could be no slavery north of the Ohio River in the Northwest Territory. And that's a really big deal for a law because basically that's what's going to start separating us into 2 different sections, a slaveholding section and a free section. So as you can see, just south of the Ohio River, you have Kentucky and Virginia. That means you could have slaves in those states. Now, as far as transporting goods, if someone lived anywhere near the Mississippi River back in 1801, and they wanted to visit relatives along the Atlantic Ocean, along the tidewater, it would take them 6 weeks to travel, and vice versa. Now, if they're carrying heavy cargo, let's say they're carrying grain or they're carrying wood from trees that they've chopped down, now you're talking about a 2-month travel. And this is on really paths. It's really not on roads. In fact, the easiest way to travel back then was river travel. So they're obviously going to be using the Mississippi River and the Ohio River to carry very heavy loads. So, as I said before, there are no roads west of the Appalachian Mountains, only trails. And obviously those trails are the ones that the Indians have basically set up. Who's pulling all that heavy cargo? Well, if you've got a lot of grain, wheat, corn, if you've got fur from animals that you've trapped, if you're transporting gunpowder, all of that needed to be moved by horses, oxen, or mules pulling wagons. Or, as I said before, they were moving on barges along the Ohio River or the Mississippi River. Here's a team of oxen. They are in a yoke. That is the contraption that is holding them together. And they are such heavy draft animals. They're going to be able to pull very heavy loads for long distances. Here's an example of a mule. A mule is a special kind of animal. Yeah, I know, it looks like a horse. But actually, it's a cross between a horse and a donkey. And the unfortunate thing about owning a mule is that they can't make baby mules. Only donkeys and horses can make mules. But they're really good draft animals. They're very sturdy. They can go long distances. And as you see here in this picture down below, these mules are tethered or tied to this barge on a canal. And they're actually pulling this barge down the canal. And that's one way to get heavy loads across the country. Now, once people have figured out a way to cross the Appalachian Mountains, we're going to be able to build more roads, not just use Indian trails. One of the most famous ways to cross the Appalachian Mountains was a way that the Indians showed us, and that's through what's known as the Cumberland Gap. As you can see here, the Cumberland Gap is right around the border of Virginia and Kentucky, pretty much where the Smoky Mountains are today. This is an aerial view of the Cumberland Gap. So you can see the mountains aren't that high. It wouldn't be that difficult getting covered wagons through those mountains. So this was a way to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Perhaps you've even heard of someone named Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone was a friend of the Indians. He knew how to speak some Indian languages, and he found out from them that this was the easiest way to cross the Appalachian Mountains. Let's talk about water travel. In 1801, all very heavy items were moved in canoes or rafts powered by muscle. Rivers, lakes, or a few man-made canals were the only waterways. And those man-made canals, those were really tough to make. Americans at this time, interestingly, could not move goods by land or water any faster than the ancient Greeks or Romans. And that's really extraordinary to think of it that way, because we're talking about thousands of years where there's been very little improvement in transportation. Here's some examples of these rafts that we're talking about. And notice that there are no women here, so it was men working these rafts, and you notice the poles in the water. Now, the riverbed would not be that deep in this instance because they could pretty much push the raft along the riverbed and remove the debris that's floating around it, like that big branch there. And then they've got another guy with a really long oar to move. Notice there's no sail here, because sometimes on the rivers you don't have enough wind and you're going against the current. If you're going against the current, it's going to take a lot of hard muscle power to move that raft of goods. And you wonder what might be in these wooden barrels. Maybe that's the cargo. We don't know for sure. Probably is. Here's a famous painting depicting some guys floating some goods down a river. The river looks pretty wide, so my guess is it's either the Ohio River or the Mississippi River. And they're probably not running into too many people, so they have to entertain themselves. And it looks like this guy's doing some sort of jig here. Here's another example of a raft. Interestingly, Abraham Lincoln, when he was a young man, he took some cargo down from a town in Illinois all the way down the Mississippi River to New Orleans, something very similar to this. That's where he had his first experience with seeing slaves. And you actually see a little lean-to there where they probably sought shelter when they wanted to sleep or get out of the rain. All right, let's talk about this guy. This guy was our third president. His name is Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson lived south of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, which means there were no stagecoach steps. There was no real means of public transportation. So, how did he travel to Philadelphia from his home in Monticello for the Constitutional Convention in 1789? He traveled on his own horseback. It took him 10 days. This is his home, Monticello. His slaves built this. He designed it. He was an architect, an engineer. He was really a Renaissance man. He also played many musical instruments, and he also spoke many different languages, including the dead ones, Greek and Latin. But yeah, this is the home he left when he had to go to the Constitutional Convention in 1789. And here's a painting of Monticello depicting, looks like his daughter's there in the front. So, Thomas Jefferson never saw a train in his lifetime. He died in 1826. So, there you go. No trains at that point. As I said before, it took him 10 days to go the 225 miles from his home in Monticello, Virginia to Philadelphia. Amazing.